We're just going to go through this and just look at each chapter. We will put, we will bounce back and forth with 2 Kings as sort of additional information. And so King Joram we see him in chapter 21. And I think it's really interesting. King Joram became king. He was the eldest son of Jehoshaphat. Now, I was able to kind of look up some names, and I thought this was really interesting. King Jehoram, his name means Jehovah is exalted. That's what his name means. Pretty sad. He is the one, his wife, he married Athaliah, A-H-A-L-I-A-H. Athaliah, thank you, I'll take that. She is the daughter of Ahab. Remember, Jehoshaphat was trying to bring some unity between Israel and Judah, which, you know, it was a good idea, but it wasn't the best decision. So because God wasn't in it, right? So Ahab is the king of Israel. Jehoram is the king of Judah. So Jehoshaphat had 6 brothers, and it says he gave them all gifts and cities and money, but the kingdom was given to Jehoram because he was the firstborn son. All right, just because of his position. And what did he do right off the bat? It says he had these brothers, and when he took over the kingdom in verse 4, he killed all his brothers with the sword, and some of the rulers of Israel also. Now, it's very interesting when you think about this guy. He killed his brothers and some leaders. I wonder if these were guys that were like Jehoshaphat. You know, I mean, why would he do that? Who do you think advised him to do that? Athaliah. Okay. Athaliah. So this lady advises to kill the competition. And I hadn't thought about it till Peggy talked about this thing going on at their church. How this is kind of a picture of that in a way. Interesting. This king is 32 years old, and he was 7 years old when his dad became king, and saw his dad reign for 25 years. Okay. And what did he see in that 25 years with Jehoshaphat? What kind of a king was Jehoshaphat? He was a good king, right? He served the Lord. He went around and taught people. He saw 25 years of good, godly rule. And obviously Jehoshaphat was a good dad. He gave them gifts, he took care of them, he was very faithful. And he really had a problem, because one really major unwise decision that Jehoshaphat did is what caused this problem. So 2 Corinthians 6:14-16, I think is a really, really good verse. I looked this up. 2 Corinthians, I don't think it was in your homework. All the things that I'm getting ready to do, all the stuff that I'm studying right now, I can't keep it all straight in my head anymore. So the International Children's Bible Translation, which I love that. It's better than the that one that's like a commentary one. What is it? The Bible that they write it in common language. I can't remember. What's the message? No. But that might be like it. But anyway, they are much more doctrinally correct in their translation, but it's written in simple children's language.
Tell me on that version.
ICB, International Children's Bible. So, yeah, it says, you are not the same as those who do not believe. So do not join yourself to them. Good and bad do not belong together. Light and darkness cannot share together. How can Christ and Belial, the devil, have any agreement? What can a believer have together with a non-believer? The temple of God cannot have any agreement with idols. And we are the temple of the living God. As God said, I will live with them and walk with them. I will be their God and they will be my people. Isn't that a great translation of that verse? And that's exactly what's happening. Jehoshaphat tried to make an agreement with a pagan worshiping king. It is not going to work, right? So the consequence of all of this that's happened here, all the decisions that were made, here's the consequence. Revolt of Libnah, let me make sure I get it right, of Edom and Libnah. Now, what's so interesting about this, why did they revolt against this king? He's killed all of his brothers off. He's gone back to Baal worship. He's doing all these things because he's hanging out with his buddy Ahab, right? What did they say was the reason? Because the king forsook the Lord. That's why they revolted. They said, we're not going to have a party of this because this king has forsaken the Lord. He's not like the rule of Jehoshaphat. They didn't try to fight with him. But it says in verse 11, he made the high places in the mountains of Judah and caused the people to play the harlot and led Judah astray. Now, what's very interesting is we get to verse 12. I had to look at this to make sure I understood. So he said, then a letter came to him from Elijah the prophet saying, thus says the Lord God of your father David, because you've not walked in the ways of Jehoshaphat your father and the ways of Asa king of Judah, but have walked in the ways of the king of Israel and have caused Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to play the harlot at the house of Ahab, as the house of Ahab played the harlot, and you've also killed your brothers, your own family, who were better than you. Behold, the Lord is going to strike your people, your sons, your wives, and all your possessions with great calamity. And you will suffer severe sickness, a disease of your bowels, until your bowels come out because of the sickness day by day. Wow. Good. Doesn't sound very good. It is not good. Now, let me just tell you about this letter. It says, I looked up a commentary on that. It said it believes that this letter was written before Elijah was taken up into heaven, and the letter was delivered to this king after Elijah had been translated up to heaven. So they believe that as this guy said, I loved his phrase, Elijah's trip to heaven took place somewhere near the second year of Jehoram's reign in Judah. So he gets his prophecy, he writes it all down, he gets translated up, and I guess a son of the prophets came and brought it to the king. Okay, so he's gone, the king gets this, and man, it just doesn't seem to affect him very much, does it? He's already done these things, and here's the other thing that really stood out to me. This is before the king has killed his family, I think, or maybe it's a prophecy of the Lord to him, judging him for something that he's done. He may have just done it. The prophecy may have come about right before he did it, but it is definitely something that Jehoram would not have expected a letter from Elijah. That's all I'm saying. He would not have known that this was going to be coming his way, and it didn't get his attention. It didn't. It was kind of amazing. You're going to die of a horrible disease, and he can't seem to understand that. So, what happens in verse 16? The Lord stirs up against Jehoram the spirit of the Philistines, the Arabs, and the Ethiopians. And they came against Judah and invaded it and carried away all the possessions found in the king's house together, with his sons and his wives, so that no son was left him except Jehoaz, the youngest of his sons. So after all this, the Lord smote him in his bowels with an incurable sickness. And it came about in the course of time, at the end of 2 years, that his bowels came out because of his sickness, and he died in great pain. And his people made no fire for him like the fire of his fathers. He was 32 years old when he became king. He reigned in Jerusalem 8 years. So how old is he? 40. And he departed with no one's regret. And they buried him in the city of David, but not in the tomb of the kings. Wow. People were glad to see him go. That is terrible. They were probably like, relief. Sobering. But this is a guy who absolutely, in that 8 years of all the things that happened, it doesn't say anything about him crying out to the Lord when he got sick. Remember King Hezekiah? What did he do? He got that sore in his belly, and Isaiah came to him and said, "You're going to die." And he turned to the Lord, and he started praying and asking God, "Where I've been faithful to you, please." This guy didn't even think about doing that. There's no commentary of him turning around and saying, "Hey, I'm sorry." What happened to Ahab in the beginning? Remember in Naboth when he killed the guy Naboth in the vineyard of Naboth, and he repented, and so God gave him more time, right? And then he comes back later and he still acts like a fool, and God's got to take him out, right? So, chapter 22. We just think it just gets worse and worse, doesn't it? Here's chapter 22. So, then the inhabitants of Jerusalem made Ahaziah, his youngest son, king in his place, for the band of men who came with the Arabs to the camp had slain all the older sons. That was part of the consequence. I was just going to write this down. He forsook the Lord, and the Lord sent his enemies, who killed his sons and took his wives, obviously not this wife, and possessions. This had to happen before he died, right? because it says that the Lord inspired these people, right? In verse 16, stirred up against Jehoram the spirit of the Philistines, the Arabs, and the Ethiopians, and they came against Judah and invaded it. Carried away all the possessions found in the king's house together with his sons and his wives, so that no son was left him except Jehoaz, the youngest of his sons. Wow. Pretty sad. Now, why did he do that? Why did God do that? Why didn't he take them all?
Because he had to leave the lineage of Judah.
That's right. He was faithful to the lineage of Judah. Oh, hold on a second. Mary's calling me. Hello? Hey.
Kelly, we've been from that rehabilitation hospital,
Okay.
stroke.
You're gonna go up there?
Oh, no. That'd be nice.
Yeah.
Gotta be another person.
Okay. Hey, listen, I'm right in the middle of teaching a class that's being recorded. That's okay. I'll call you back. Okay. All right, bye. Sorry. It's one of our clients in the rehab hospital. She had a stroke and I wanted to tell me about it. So anyway, okay, where am I at? Okay. So Ahaziah becomes king. I thought it was so fascinating because Jehoram's name means Jehovah is exalted. That didn't happen. Ahaziah, Ahasiah. His name means Jehovah holds or Jehovah possesses. That's what his name means. Interesting how this very ungodly man continues the lineage of naming godly characteristics to his sons. What would we call that today? When somebody does that, what does that say about them? That's a hard question.
That he named his son a godly son. What hypocritical.
He's a hypocrite. Absolutely. Because what he's saying, what he's doing, do not match. So Ahaziah becomes king, and 2 Chronicles 21, 16 and 17 tells us that the Philistines and the Arabians killed all the other brothers, took the treasures, the wives, everything but the youngest son. He was 22 years old and he reigned 1 year. And it goes from bad to worse because who's his mother? So,
Athaliah.
Athaliah. You get to say that. We're going to just keep recording that. Athaliah.
Yeah.
Athaliah is his mom. And what does she do? She's the wicked counselor.
So like if she was Ahaz's daughter, then her mother was Jezebel?
Right.
Ooh. So she's like carrying on
Yeah,
the legacy of Jezebel.
that's right. She gives him wicked counsel. She really does some stuff that, it's kind of shocking. And it says, they point out that she is the granddaughter of Omri. I thought that was really interesting because Omri is the one who bought the land and built the city and named it Samaria, right?
Mhm.
So he's the one that made the clean break because Jehoaz, I'm trying to remember the name, I'm real tired, so I can't think of it. But the original capital was not Samaria. And it was Shiloh. That's what it was Shiloh. And what happened in Shiloh? They originally that was one of the places where they kept the Ark of the Covenant before the temple was built. So there was some semblance of godliness even in him. Because he tried to, what did he do? Tried to get priests, he tried to get, he tried to organize all this stuff, but of course they were worshiping golden calves. But there was some sort of loose semblance to what God had designed. But this guy came in and built Samaria and changed the name of that nation from Israel to Samaritans. Sumerians. And he is noted here for that reason, I think, because it shows a sea change shift. There was partial obedience, partially things were happening, but all of a sudden, boom, man, we have flipped the switch totally. And so he reigns a year, and his reign is awful. He walked in the ways of the house of Ahab, for his mother was his counselor who did wickedly. He did evil in the sight of the Lord like the house of Ahab, for they were his counselors after the death of his father to his destruction. So mom gives him wicked counsel. Ahab, counselors are his people to do wicked things. And so he also walked according to their counsel and went with Jehoram, the son of Ahab's king of Israel, to wage war against Hazael, king of Aram, at Ramoth Gilead, but the Arameans wounded Joram. So he returns to be healed at Jezreel. So Joram gets off the battlefield because he's got to heal. And Ahaziah, the son of Jehoram, king of Judah, went down to see Joram, the son of Ahab, in Jezreel because he was sick. Verse 7. The destruction of Ahaziah was from God. God said, "You're out." So here's something that we should think about. If God decides to judge, this is it. He's going to judge. Nothing is going to stop that. And he knows the exact right time. He knows exactly what needs to happen when it happens. And it doesn't matter. Obviously, he already knows Ahaziah's heart. He knows what's going to happen. So he went to Joram. When he came, he went out with Jehoram against Jehu, the son of Nimshi. The Lord had anointed to cut off the house of Ahab. Now, I just want to think about this just a second here. Ahaziah's father gets a letter from Elijah saying, you're doomed, right? Elijah had been prophesying, right, to the house of Ahab. And he says in an earlier prophecy, you're going to die by the hand of Jehu, right? That was way back several chapters before. And so they you don't think that was written down somewhere that they knew about this prophecy? Of course it was. So he goes out to fight against Jehu, the son of Nimshi, whom the Lord had anointed to cut off the house of Ahab. And when Jehu was executing judgment on the house of Ahab, he found the princes of Judah and the sons of Ahaziah, brother, ministering to Ahaziah, and slew them. You guys are out too. He also sought Ahaziah, and they caught him while he was hiding in Samaria. And they brought him to Jehu, put him to death, and buried him. For they said, he is the son of Jehoshaphat, who sought the Lord with all his heart. So there was no one of the house of Ahaziah to retain the power of the kingdom. Wow. So that's very interesting because what did it tell you about Jehu? Was Jehu a godly man? No. Because what did he do? He continued to allow the Baal worship, not Baal worship, but the worship of Asherah and idols, okay? And high places. He allowed all that. But he had been anointed by God to do this. And it says in this chapter that it was from the Lord that Ahaziah was going to be killed. So it didn't say that, did it, in the original prophecies? But it's sure saying it here, right? So Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead. She rose and destroyed all the royal offspring of the house of Judah. What? So we know where Jehoram got his idea from her. She's doing it again. She is destroying the royal offspring, his sons, his children. Now, I think that's pretty crazy. Why would she do that? There's a couple of things about this that are pretty sad. Athaliah. Okay, she kills all but one of the sons. And then she crowns herself as queen of Judah. Now, let me just point something out here. Jehoshaphat was trying to unify. So he became unequally yoked. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Athaliah is doing the exact same thing. She's trying to unify Judah and Israel. Jehoshaphat tried to unify Judah and Israel. He did not obey the Lord in that. And God blessed him because he was a good man. He made a mistake. And he paid the consequence to his family. Generation after generation suffering from that consequence because they invited in somebody they were unequally yoked with to go in and bring in all this junk into their lives. And we see it right here. Now the grandson has been killed because God intervened, and then the great grandchildren are now all dead except for one. And it's just very interesting to see how these things came about. So Jehoshaphat, the king's daughter, so that means the sister of Jehoram, or no, Athaliah's, Ahashia, there's so many names. Ahashia's sister is the one that gets the youngest and hides him. And so I get Joash. So I'm just going to write sister because it's just hard to. Sister of Ahashia saves Joash and hides him for 6 years in the temple. Now, it wasn't in the holy place of the temple. They had lots of rooms and stuff. The priests would stay there. There's all kinds of things that they were doing. And this kind of stuff was still going on. That's what's so amazing about it. They probably had pretty low attendance, didn't have a lot to do because nobody was following them. But there were some godly people that were interested in that. And she is the wife, Jehoiada, the priest. And for 6 years, this young man, Joash, is getting tutelage and protection from the high priest and his aunt. Okay? So Joash is under, I wish these names were easier to say. Jehoiada. Jehoiada.
Jehoiada. Jehoiada.
You're gonna get the gold star. So 6 years go by. And we get to the 7th year.
It's amazing to me that you could hide a kid for 6 years.
Well,
Yeah,
he would never go in there. She wasn't going into the temple.
But it seems like somebody around,
Well,
yeah.
it's
You
just
would think.
amazing that would happen. Hasn't that happened before where they've hidden someone away for a certain amount of time?
yes.
Not discovered.
Right.
And it's also amazing to me that woman, Athaliah,
Mhm.
has so much power. Where did all that power come from? I know her lineage, but somewhere there had to be someone who would step up and say, what she's doing.
Well, that does happen. But why did it happen? How was she able to get that power?
I don't know.
Well, because of the pagan nature of things. So pagan religion, that's what we kind of talked about earlier when we were talking about really the church thing. Women, the priestesses had power and authority in pagan religions. So she probably was, sought after for maybe some of the ways that she did sacrifices or some of the occultic or idolatrous things that they were doing. But most definitely, she had the ability because she was able, she didn't personally slit the necks of all those kids. She had her followers, people that were dedicated to her that came in there and did that.
Dedicated out of fear or hired by her?
I
or-
think there were people dedicated to this way of life. Because there's a big jump. You might be able to keep a low profile. Okay, I'm just gonna say it. In the church today, there's a lot of people keeping a low profile. Rather than saying, that's wrong. Shouldn't do that. There's a big difference between a low profile person who doesn't agree and somebody who says, yeah, I'll take them out. If they're killing those kids, they are committed to her and what she's promised them and the way that they're gonna live. And this is a whole lot, what we start seeing here for the rest of this study, we start to see the difference. This is the thing that I found to be really encouraging. The difference between what one godly man can do in a nation. Because this Jehoiada, how do you say it? Jehoiada, he turned that nation around, one man. And it's kind of amazing to me. Now, in the end, it doesn't work out the way it should. We hoped it would, but we start to see something happening here that is, I think, really profound about what God is doing.
It just looks like a battle between good and evil.
It is.
I don't understand, I can't keep all these people straight in my head,
I know.
and it looks like evil is winning.
But don't you think that she really had kind of a charisma?
Oh,
Like,
absolutely.
because I've noticed that there are certain people, like even in today, maybe not even in church, but in certain groups, my husband and I were actually talking about this morning. There's certain people that, for whatever reason, they seem to have a following. They have groupies that follow them and just like,
Well,
whatever they say is like,
What would be the
yes.
appeal? What would be the appeal of this woman? What is the thing that would be
There
appealing?
had to be something about her that was,
Do what you want,
yeah.
and you can still be religious. We can still do sacrifices. So what if you're having sex with children or whatever they were doing?
Mm-hmm.
She was indulging their fleshly desire. The only way that, once somebody gets hooked into doing that with some authority over them, it's very hard to break that. And then they have a conflict, You know, you're gonna hang around with people who think like you do. Jeffrey Epstein, it's a phenomenal picture of that, right?
Yeah.
All the people that came to see him and hung out at his resort and all that kind of stuff, or his fancy house on the island. Can't tell me that birds of a feather flock together, right? So they certainly weren't gonna oppose that because they got to do what they wanted. And I just think that's what's going on here. She probably had some good stories and good, you know, hopeful things that we'll all unify, we'll be one nation again. We'll get to do all this, and because there were counselors and people going back and forth between those two kingdoms, right? I mean, how did Ahaziah get all this help, right, from the counselors of Ahab? How'd that happen? They are communicating and she's making promises. That's what's going on, and they're getting to do what they want to do. So that's what's going on. So the first 6 years, Joash is living with his aunt and uncle, and he's being taught by a godly man. He is actually being taught by a very godly man, which is amazing. It is totally amazing. So, 23. Oh, here we go. Now, in the 7th year, Jehoiada strengthened himself and took captains of hundreds, Azariah the son of Jehoram, Ishmael, Azariah, Ahasiah, Eliphat. Okay, 5 guys. And these were men who were godly men. They went throughout Judah and gathered the Levites from all the cities of Judah and the heads of the fathers' households of Israel, and they came to Jerusalem. So he begins to gather people, godly people, to him. All right. I'm just going to put under here, he taught Joash the law. That hadn't been done in quite a while, right? At least in not 10 years, 9 or 10 years if that happened. So it was, yeah, it would be 7 and 8. What is that? 13, 15 years? 15 years that there was nobody teaching anything about the law officially. Okay, to any king, for sure. So he starts to, I'm just going to say his name's Jeff, okay? Because it's a lot of work to write. Okay, he started organizing. He organized his people. He did something very important. They entered into a covenant with him. They made covenant with this priest, this high priest. That is a very important thing. We don't, how many times have you marked that word since we've been doing this study? It was way back when we were talking about Solomon, right? You don't see a lot of covenant making going on. They went throughout Judah. They gathered all these heads of households. They assembled, then all the assembly made a covenant with the king in the house of God. So these people, his people made a covenant, right, with him. And then, verse 3, they all who were gathered made covenant with the king in the king's house. Now, what that means is that we're not talking about in the main temple, the Holy of Holies or the holy place. it would be the house that this young man was living in. That's what they're saying. So in his house, all these people came and they made covenant with him. They made a promise. And this is what it was. Jehoiada said to them, behold, the king's son shall reign as the Lord has spoken concerning the sons of David. This is the thing which you shall do. All right, so then he starts to organize. So first he tells them they're going to do this, and then he sets up this whole thing. The 7th year comes. This is in the 7th year. And then he says, covenant with the teams. And then he sets up a rotation of duties. Now, these are all people who have made covenant and they understand. So we're going to have a rotation of those duties. He assembles teams, and these teams are going to be at the house of the king, at the king's house. And what are they going to be doing? Protection, right? And then he makes a covenant with a young priest, that's all in this chapter, makes covenant with the young king and the priests. And that's going to be, let's see, I think that's further down in the in verse 16, covenant. Well, actually, it's part of this other one. That is king. That he's going to be king. We'll move that one down a little bit further. And then he says, no one can approach the king or be around him. So it's full-time protection because this priest, Jehoiada, knows it's going to be a very tough transition.
Sounds like if he had been found out.
Not yet.
Okay.
Not yet, but they're.
But if they're doing full-time,
They want to make sure that it is not known. That's why they're making covenant. He makes a
Okay.
covenant with these people to make sure they understand, do not get this young man exposed before we're ready, is what he's saying. And the thing that he did was anybody who was in this covenant, they could not go home. Okay? So he wasn't letting the teams come in and leave and go back home, which is what they normally do. They'd serve for a month and then they'd go home. Then he'd come back on the next rotation, then they'd go home. That didn't happen. These guys stayed there the whole time. And part of the reason that he did that was to make sure that it stayed quiet, what they were doing.
and that didn't seem odd to their families that they weren't coming back.
Well, they all they had to do is say, we're doing priestly duties. You know, they were in a covenant. And so the families, you would, I mean, we don't know, I can only assume that if these were godly leaders, godly men, they probably had godly households. And their wives, if they did know, would have supported them. Because what's going on in the country? What's happening in Judah right now? You have a pagan queen, a Gentile queen, the first time in Jews' history to have someone not in the line of David, somebody not a man, ruling over Judah. This is absolutely, you can't go any lower than that. It is no different than being an Egyptian or, Philistine or anybody else, in a very, very male-dominated world anyway. To have a woman ruling over that nation would be pretty shocking. So I would think that their family would be let's, you know,
Okay.
get things back.
Gotcha.
So, and you know, when I was studying this, I think we're talking about America. I mean, it's the same thing. It's the same kind of thing. Such corruption going on, such horrible, horrible corruption.
And just where are the good people
Well, there's some good people here.
coming?
They're here.
You know, it reminds, you know, I think so. Reminds me of the Emperor's Clothes, you know,
Mhm.
the sword.
Right.
He's naked and the people are convinced nothing's wrong with that.
And given the law. He was given a copy of the law. Verse 11, he gets crowned. They have officially crowned him as the king.
And how old is he?
7 years old. He's given a copy of the law and anointed to rule. Then we see the queen. Oh my goodness.
He's 7 years old, but he's still being, and he's being cared for.
Yeah.
By aunt and uncle.
Yep. So verse 12, when Athaliah heard the noise of the people running and praising the king, she came into the house of the Lord to the people. So he hadn't been going in there because there's nothing going on. Nobody's interested. She looked, and behold, the king was standing by his pillar at the entrance, and the captains and the trumpeters were beside the king, and all the people of the land rejoiced and blew trumpets, the singers with their musical instruments leading the praise. And Athaliah tore her clothes and said, treason, treason. I mean, this cracks me up. And then Jehoiada the priest brought out the captains of hundreds who were appointed over the army and said to them, bring her out between the ranks, and whoever follows her, put to death with the sword. For the priest said, let her not be put to death in the house of the Lord. So she was not inside of the temple complex. They took her outside the temple complex and they put her to death. So when she arrived at the entrance of the horse gate of the king's house, they put her to death there. And then this incredible covenant. Then Jehoiada made a covenant between himself and all the people and the king that they would be the Lord's people.
Praise the Lord.
And then this is the thing that happens, right? That's so amazing. Verse 16. The people, the priest, the king, covenant to serve the Lord only. And what's so fascinating is what happens next, verse 17. All the people went to the house of Baal and tore it down, and they broke in pieces his altars and his images, and killed Mattan, the priest of Baal, before the altars. Wow. The people what does it say the people do? Destroy. Yep. Remove Baal. Then it says, moreover, Jehoiada placed the offices of the house of the Lord under the authority of the Levitical priests, whom David had assigned over the house of the Lord, to offer burnt offerings to the Lord, as it is written in the law of Moses, with rejoicing and singing according to the order of David. They are having the happy dance of the century. He stationed the gatekeepers of the house of the Lord so that no one would enter who was in any way unclean. He took the captain of hundreds, the nobles, the rulers of the people, and all the people of the land, brought the king down from the house of the Lord, and came through the upper gate to the king's house, to the castle, or the palace, and they placed the king upon the royal throne. Verse 21. So all of the people of the land rejoiced, and the city was quiet, for they had put Athaliah to death with the sword. So I just want to point out something to me, very profound. One man changed the nation. One man changed the nation. That's, to me, that is an amazing statement.
And it was one man that saved the world.
That's right. Exactly right. So it says at this point, it had been 14 years since Jehoshaphat died. At this point. Then we get to chapter 24. Man, I tell you, you think it's gonna be good, and then all of a sudden, bam, we got a whole new thing. So it says, Jehoash was 7 years old when he became king, and he reigned 40 years in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Zibiah from Beersheba. So we're just gonna make a list of the things that happened. And I'm gonna read it through, and then we'll talk about it. Joash did what was right in the sight of the Lord all the days of Jehoiada, the priest. Jehoiada took 2 wives for him, so he gave this young king 2 wives. He became the father of sons and daughters. And it came about after this that Joash decided to restore the house of the Lord. So, I mean, it wasn't just that there were things going on. It had been really damaged. It had been torn. Things had been taken. They didn't have all the things that they used to have. It really needed to be taken care of. He gathered the priests and the Levites and said to them, go out to the cities of Judah and collect money for all Israel to repair the house of your God annually. And you shall do the matter quickly. But the Levites did not act quickly. So it actually was, when you look at Kings, they actually waited, I think, 23 years. And I think I have that in the notes. They just kept putting it off. They weren't going to do it. And they were taking the money for themselves. And so the king, in verse 6, summons Jehoiada, the chief priest, and said to him, why have you not required the Levites to bring you in from Judah and from Jerusalem the levy fixed by Moses? How would he know that? He is reading the law. Fixed by Moses, the servant of the Lord, on the congregation of Israel for the tent of testimony. Why isn't this being done? For the sons of the wicked Athaliah has broken into the house of God and even used the holy things of the house of the Lord for the Baals. So he's saying that, you know, things have to be replaced because we've had Baal worship all this time, and it's got to be fixed. So the king commanded, and they made a chest and set it outside the gate of the house of the Lord. They made a proclamation in Judah and Jerusalem to bring to the Lord the levy fixed by Moses, the servant of God, on Israel in the wilderness. All the officers and all the people rejoiced and brought in their levies and dropped them in the chest until they had finished. It came about whenever the chest was brought into the king's officer by the Levites. And when they saw that there was much money, then the king's scribe and the chief priest officer would come, empty the chest, take it, and return it to his place. They did this daily and collected much money. The king and Jehoiada gave it to those who did the work of the service of the house of the Lord, and they hired masons and carpenters to restore the house of the Lord and to fix things up. So the workmen labored, and the repair progressed in their hands, and they restored the house of the Lord according to its specifications and strengthened it. So when they had finished, they brought the rest of the money before the king and Jehoiada, and it was made into utensils for the house of the Lord, utensils for service, for the burnt offering, for the pans, and the silver and the gold, and all of that. And it says, and they offered burnt offerings in the house of the Lord continually all the days of Jehoiada. So let's just make a list of those first 14 verses, okay? Jehoash, before Jehoiada dies, okay? Before Jehoiada dies. I just couldn't fit that in. He did right before God, before the Lord. He did right in the sight of the Lord. He decided to restore God's house, the house of the Lord. He gathered priests. And he commanded, raise funds, raise some money. In the 7th year, which is what we're talking about, he began to pay the workers. This is the 7th year of his reign, not his age.
So
of
when he
7.
was 14.
Yeah, pay the workers. And rebuild. So what happens? This is in Kings chapter 12. They did not do the work. They didn't do it. So it says, verse 4, 2 Kings 12. Then Jehoash said to the priest, which is also Joash, you know how they do, they like to switch these names around. All the money of the sacred things which is brought into the house of the Lord is in current money, both the money of each man's assessment, and this is verse 4 of chapter 12 of 2 Kings, and the money which is in any man's heart prompts him to bring into the house of the Lord. Let the priests take it for themselves, each from his acquaintance, and they shall repair the damage of the house wherever any damage may be found. So what he's doing, he's telling the priest to rebuild. That's how it starts. But it came about that in the 23rd year of King Jehoash, the priests had not repaired the damages of the house. They hadn't done it. They just taken the money. The king called Jehoiada the priest and for the other priests and said to them, why do you not repair the damage? Now therefore take no more money from your acquaintances, but pay it for the damage of the house. Take the money that you got and you fix the house. Enough money has been raised. Verse 8, so the priest agreed that they would take no more money from the people, nor repair the damage. So he was saying, no, we're not going to do it. And that's where you see in 2024, where they're collecting this money and they start to make these checks in order to keep it. The priests get the money, they take it out and set it aside so that the workers can get paid. Now they've had to hire outside workers to come do this because the priests are refusing to do it because they haven't gotten paid. But they've been paid for 23 years and haven't done anything. Okay. Jehoiada the priest took a chest and bored a hole in its lid and put it beside the altar on the right side as one comes into the house of the Lord. So he made a drop box. They could not be opened, okay, except by a key, is what they're saying. And the house of the Lord, and the priest who guarded the threshold put in it all the money which was brought into the house of the Lord. When they saw there was much money in the chest, the king's scribe and high priest came up, tied it in bags, counted the money, and which was found in the house of the Lord. They gave the money which was weighed into the hands of those who did the work, who had the oversight of the house of the Lord, and they paid it out to the carpenters and the builders who worked on the house of the Lord, and the masons and the stone cutters and all the people who are buying. And then whatever was left, they made silver cups and snuffers and trumpets and all these things. And they repaired the house of the Lord. Verse 15, moreover, they did not require an accounting for the men in whose hands they gave the money to pay to those who did the work, for they dealt faithfully. They didn't have to manage the people were faithfully doing the job. The money from the guilt offering, the money from the sin offering was not brought into the house of the Lord, it was for the priest. That's how it was supposed to be, right? So then we get into this other little section here. I'm going to get there in just a second. So they pay the workers, right? The priests did not work diligently. I'm gonna leave, you can put that in your notes. The king commanded, fulfill the law. That's what he's saying. Fulfill the law, do your job. And they said, no, we're not doing it. And then they gave burnt offerings continually. And because of this, and then the interesting thing is, all the officers and people rejoiced and brought more tithe. Because he did this, the people have joy and they are tithing. Because why do you want to tithe? Just to fill the pockets if somebody's not doing anything. It actually increased it, okay? So then we get to the next part. After Jehoiada dies, Joash after Jehoiada dies, man, I tell you what, 17 through 27. This is so sad because, and I'm going to tell you, I know I need to hurry up because I'm running out of time here, but let me just tell you, this is our country. The leader changes, the people change. When that godly person gets out of office, everybody just goes in the tank. It's exactly, I mean, I was reading this, it's like, it's too real. It's too real. So, verse 17. After the death of Jehoiada, the officials of Judah came and bowed down to the king, and the king listened to them. Okay, so he gets wicked officials, basically. I can't help but think about Biden. People running behind the scenes, giving them all this horrible advice. That is exactly what happened here.
They're pulling the strings.
They're pulling the
He's
strings.
just a puppet.
He's just a puppet. Here's a
Well, he
guy,
isn't even a conscious puppet,
No,
right?
because
Well,
he can't do what they want him to do unless they have a prompter for him.
well, the thing that's so bad here is that we have a guy who did right before the Lord and decided to restore God's house and gather priests and raise funds, pay the workers, fulfill the law. I mean, this is a guy who was doing the right thing. When the officials come and they bow down and advise him. What? They abandon the house of the Lord. I mean, they started serving idols and Asherah. Who do you think is the one that's got that going? Way back here. This lady right here. Quite an influence all the way over here. She's still got people in town, you know? And the result is wrath. Here's a guy who should have picked it up pretty quickly, but he didn't. Wrath came upon Judah and Jerusalem. And then what did God do? God sent prophets. God sent prophets to warn them. To try to turn back to him. That was his goal. Get them turned back to him. They wouldn't listen. So to me, one of the most tragic stories here, verse 20 of chapter 24. They wouldn't listen, right? God's bringing wrath. The Spirit of God came on Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada, the priest, and he stood above the people and said to them, thus God has said, why do you transgress the commandment of the Lord and do not prosper? Because you've forsaken the Lord, he has forsaken you. Hello, people. What do they do? All these wicked officials, they conspire against him. So the Lord sent Zechariah, the son, and he calls out
the king, what are you doing?
And what do? They conspired. And they stoned him to death in the court of the house of the Lord. Now, let me tell you, his father took that queen out of the house of the Lord before she was put to death. Blood was shed of a godly priest in the courts of the house of the Lord. That is the height of insult to do that. And this is a man appointed by God. He was anointed by God, and they kill him. Killed by the officials. And he says, verse 22, thus Joash the king did not remember the kindness which his father Jehoiada, that's his adopted father, had shown him, but he murdered his son. Now that is strong language in the Bible. He murdered his son. And as he died, he said, may the Lord see and avenge. So Zechariah says, God avenge. Now, what is he saying is the thing he wants to have avenged? Not his death, but the sin against the Lord, because he's a godly man. I'm just going to put that. I don't have one. So now it happened in the turn of the year that the army of the Arameans came up against him. They're coming up against this king Joash. And they came to Judah and Jerusalem, destroyed all the officials of the people from among the people, and sent all their spoils to the king of Damascus. Indeed, the army of the Arameans came with a small number of men, yet the Lord delivered a very great army into their hands, because they had forsaken the Lord, the God of their fathers. Thus they executed judgment on Joash. He is judged because of his sin. And what is so sad about that is that when they had departed from him, for they left him very sick. In other words, he's actually kind of been wounded. His own servants conspired against him because of the blood of the son of Jehoiada the priest, and murdered him in his bed. So he died, and they buried him in the city of David, but they did not bury him in the tomb of the kings. And then he starts listing, now those who conspired against him, Zabad, the son of Shemeth, the Ammonites, is basically Moab and Ammon, is who God uses to murder him, or to execute him. As to his sons and the many oracles against him and the rebuilding of the house of God, behold, they are written in the trees of the book of the king, that Amaziah, his son, became king in his place. That is pretty dang tragic. So, what is the message? There was a renewal that happened in this nation for at least, 35 years, something like that. There was an incredible.
City reigned for 40 years.
It reigned for 40 years, and it had to be a certain period of time from the time Jehoiada, the priest, died. And so, from that period on, things went down fast. What does that tell us? We should really think about that. Can we pass our faith on to our children? We can't. We can do everything we can to give them all the tools that they need. We cannot make them believe.
No.
And what is
Each man has to make that decision.
this was a very weak guy. One of the things that I was reading one commentary that said one of the things that the priest did wrong is he did all the right steps, but he didn't apparently really question Joash to say, do you understand the relationship? Because as long as this priest was alive, before he died, godly all the way. Well, who was the influence? Who was the counselor? Godly counsel. As soon as that guy was gone, these guys jumped right in, some 30, probably 35 years later. And they got in there, and in a very short time. How long has it taken for our country to fall? 2 years. So, what does it mean to renew your faith? And it's in here, but I just want to read it. Renewal means commitment. You make the decision. It means going beyond what you say. It requires worship. It requires obeying the God. It requires a guard, your eyes, your ears, your mouth, your heart gate. That it requires you to guard that. Wasn't that what that priest was doing? He set guards over them, over him, full-time protection. He put godly men around him. He did everything he could to help this young man become a godly king. It says that renewal requires getting rid of unclean things in our lives. Renewal requires the correct ruler of your heart. Who is sitting on the throne of our heart? All of these things require something else, genuine submission. Joash was not genuinely submitted. So I looked up the word submission or submit. It means to arrange under, to subordinate, to subject, to put in subjection, to subject oneself, to obey, to submit to the control of another, which would be God, to yield one's admonishment or advice. It's a Greek military term meaning to arrange in a military fashion under the command of a leader. And in a non-military fashion, it was a voluntary attitude of giving in, cooperating, assuming responsibility, and carrying burden. That young man was doing that under this godly direction. And he couldn't apparently seem to see the blessing that he was getting. We have a standard to live by when we do these things. When we submit to the Lord and He leads us, then we have a standard. And Joash was murdered by his friends, and he was murdered because he thought it was okay to murder somebody who spoke against him. I mean, I think that's pretty profound. I just kept thinking about our current situation, the retribution going against people who oppose the government. You know, it isn't a matter of having a conversation. It's a matter of destroy, destroy, destroy. There's the things that stood out to me was number one, all it took was one determined person to change the course of a nation. And all it took was one faithless leader to destroy a nation. It's the most, profound study. And I just can't imagine what lesson 5 is going to be. But we're so, I'm so overwhelmed by how current this study is. And you look behind the scenes to see all this stuff. There's people that stand up every single day and say, I'm a good Catholic, I'm a good Christian, I'm a good this, that, or the other. But they are play choice. They are willing to go against their enemies. They're willing to call a person who disagrees with them an enemy when they just have a different view. You know, I mean, it is not required for us to take each other out because we don't agree. And that is what is the common practice today. We are really in trouble if we cannot understand what is going on here. So, as you do your homework this week, do your homework. Next week's the last lesson. Give me out around. Think about how this impacts what we do today. What can we learn from this that would help us today in dealing with our family, our friends, work, whatever we're doing? We have an opportunity to be a light. And I was studying Isaiah this morning. Here am I, send me. Remember, God gave Isaiah a ministry and said, nobody's gonna listen to you. Well, what if we are all alone and nobody listens to us? What does that mean? So what, right? We are still called. We still answer to the Lord. We still have responsibilities to God. We should not be tearing down each other in the church when we ought to be building up and coming to unity. Because if the church, it says in 1 Peter, will be the first to be judged, right? Why was Judah judged so much by God? Because he had called out Judah to be what? The heritage of Christ. They had a special calling, and they were meant to do something pretty profound. And they kept going back and doing the wrong thing. Church is really in trouble, I think, in America right now. And we are not paying attention to the things that really matter. And number one is, am I committed to the Lord to do what he's called me to do? Number one. Am I submitting to the Lord? And then everything else that happens, it's in his hands. And I can have peace about it. Doesn't mean it's going to be easy or fun. But we should be able to have the confidence that God is working in my life and has called me to do something. And whatever happens, it really has to be between the Lord and me, right? And he is faithful. He's faithful to judge. He's faithful to bless. Let's pray. Father, just thank you so much for this study. So convicting. And Father, I do pray for our nation because, Lord, we are watching this very story playing out in real time in our own lives. And we see all kinds of things happening, all kinds of internal divisions and external divisions, and people coming against other people for personal gain. It's all about control and power. But the reality is that you are the one that says how long a man is going to live on this earth. And when we sin and you judge us, you're the one who takes us out, Father. Father, I just pray that we would be people who bow the knee to you and let you be in charge of our lives, and the outcome of our lives are in your hands, so that we would be a light, an appealing light, a light that compels people to want to talk to us. And Father, just help us to love our brothers and sisters the way you love us, so that we would be a delight to the unsaved. They would want what we have. I think that it is holding a standard, Father, and we just ask you today to give us clear, firm standards that we can stand by because we trust you and because you're faithful. I thank you and I praise you in Jesus' name. Amen.